The year is 1973. The world is basking in the afterglow of a post-war economic boom, with oil as the lifeblood of progress. But beneath this economic miracle, a storm is brewing in the politically charged Middle East. Tensions are simmering, and the seeds of discontent are about to bear bitter fruit. The global dependence on oil has created a precarious balance of power. The stage is set for a confrontation that will shake the foundations of the global economy. To understand the 1973 oil crisis, we must look deeper into the history of oil. From Pennsylvania's first commercial oil well in 1859 to the Middle East's vast reserves, oil's potential ignited a revolution. It powered the rise of the automobile and fueled rapid industrialization. The U.S., once a major oil exporter, saw its domestic production peak in the early 1970s, becoming increasingly reliant on imports. The Middle East became the focal point of global energy demand. The stage was set for a complex interplay of economic interests and political maneuvering. Post-World War II saw an unprecedented surge in global economic activity. Nations embarked on ambitious reconstruction programs, leading to an insatiable appetite for energy. Oil emerged as the world's most sought-after commodity, powering factories, transportation, and homes. This surge in demand transformed the global oil industry, particularly in the Middle East. International oil companies invested heavily in developing new oil fields. However, this dependence on oil came with a hidden cost: a growing vulnerability to supply disruptions. Nowhere was the post-war love affair with oil more evident than in the United States. The American dream became increasingly intertwined with the automobile. Cars were a necessity, symbolizing freedom and aspiration. This love affair transformed the American landscape and drove the country's demand for oil. The U.S. auto industry boomed, with Detroit becoming the world's automotive capital. Suburban sprawl increased reliance on cars for commuting and leisure. However, this dependence on oil created a strategic vulnerability. While the Western world reveled in cheap oil, a looming energy crisis was brewing. In the Middle East, resentment simmered over perceived exploitation of natural resources. The formation of OPEC in 1960 marked a turning point. OPEC sought greater control over oil resources and better prices for exports. The Arab-Israeli conflict further fueled tensions. Oil emerged as a potential weapon in this geopolitical chess game. By the 1970s, the global oil landscape was transforming. Western oil companies' dominance was challenged by oil-producing nations, particularly in the Middle East. OPEC, formed in 1960, gained influence after the 1967 Six-Day War. The Arab oil embargo demonstrated the leverage oil-producing countries could wield. Growing demand for oil and declining U.S. production shifted power towards oil-exporting nations. OPEC members demanded a greater share of profits. This shift had profound geopolitical implications. As the 1970s progressed, OPEC grew increasingly assertive. The cartel demanded greater control over oil production, pricing, and distribution. In 1971, OPEC secured a substantial increase in oil prices with the Tripoli Agreement. This marked a turning point in the relationship between oil-producing nations and the industrialized world. OPEC continued to push for higher prices, influencing the global oil market. The cartel's actions contributed to rising inflation and economic instability. The stage was set for a major confrontation. The escalating tensions between OPEC and the West were exacerbated by the volatile geopolitical climate. The 1973 Yom Kippur War ignited a global crisis. OPEC used its oil weapon against the West, plunging the world into an energy crisis. The Arab oil embargo led to a sharp reduction in oil supplies and skyrocketing prices. The crisis exposed the vulnerability of the West's dependence on Middle Eastern oil. The 1973 oil crisis marked a watershed moment in global oil history. The Middle East, a region of immense strategic importance, has long been plagued by deep-seated tensions. The discovery of vast oil reserves added a new dimension to these conflicts. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire after World War I sowed the seeds of future conflicts. The discovery of oil in the early 20th century attracted international attention. The influx of Western influence exacerbated existing tensions. These factors created a volatile mix with far-reaching consequences. The creation of Israel in 1948 marked a turning point in the Arab-Israeli conflict. The 1948 Arab-Israeli War fueled a sense of grievance within the Arab world. The plight of Palestinian refugees became a rallying cry for Arab nationalists. The rise of Arab nationalism further inflamed tensions with Israel and its Western allies. Gamal Abdel Nasser emerged as a leading figure in the Arab nationalist movement. The Suez Crisis demonstrated the strategic importance of the Middle East. Section 3. The Six-Day War. A turning point. The 1967 Six-Day War, a watershed moment in the Arab-Israeli conflict, had profound implications for the region's political landscape and the global balance of power. The war, which resulted in a decisive Israeli victory and the occupation of significant Arab territories, including the Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights, and the West Bank, further inflamed tensions and solidified Israel's military dominance. The war, triggered by a series of miscalculations and escalating tensions, caught the Arab world off guard. Israel, fearing an imminent attack, launched a preemptive strike against Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, quickly overwhelming their forces and achieving a stunning victory. The speed and decisiveness of Israel's victory sent shockwaves through the Arab world, shattering the myth of Arab military superiority and leaving a legacy of humiliation and resentment. The war had far-reaching consequences. Israel's occupation of the West Bank and East Jerusalem, home to numerous Palestinian refugees and sites of immense religious significance, further complicated the already intractable conflict. The displacement of even more Palestinians, coupled with the expansion of Israeli settlements in the occupied territories, fueled Palestinian anger and undermined hopes for a peaceful resolution. The Six-Day War also had a profound impact on the Arab world's perception of the West, particularly the United States, which was seen as a staunch supporter of Israel. The war reinforced the view that the West was biased against the Arab cause and fueled calls for greater Arab unity and self-reliance. Section 4. Oil as a weapon, the stakes rise. The 1967 Six-Day War marked a turning point in the Arab world's relationship with oil. The war's outcome led to a realization that oil could be a powerful weapon. The Arab oil embargo, though short-lived, showed the potential disruption of withholding oil. The embargo demonstrated the strategic importance of oil and the West's vulnerability. The Day of Atonement, the Day of Attack. October 6, 1973, marked Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. The unexpected eruption of war shattered the fragile peace in the Middle East. Egypt and Syria launched a coordinated surprise attack on Israeli positions. The Yom Kippur War caught Israel off guard. Egyptian forces surged across the Suez Canal, breaching Israel's Bar-Lev line. Simultaneously, Syrian troops launched a powerful offensive in the Golan Heights. The suddenness and ferocity of the Arab attack sent shockwaves through Israel. As the Yom Kippur War raged, the Sinai Peninsula became a battleground of tank clashes, aerial dogfights, and infantry assaults. The Egyptian army breached the Bar-Lev line and dug in along the Suez Canal. Israel mobilized its military might, preparing for a counterattack. The Israeli Defense Forces launched counterattacks to regain the initiative. The Battle of Chinese Farm raged for 6 days, ending in an Israeli victory. The Yom Kippur War sent shockwaves far beyond the battlefields of the Middle East. The conflict, erupting at the height of the Cold War, threatened to draw the United States and the Soviet Union into a direct confrontation, raising the specter of a superpower conflict with potentially catastrophic consequences. The United States, under President Richard Nixon, airlifted massive military aid to Israel, providing crucial weapons and supplies that helped turn the tide of the war. The Soviet Union, backing its Arab allies, also provided substantial military assistance to Egypt and Syria, further fueling the conflict and raising tensions between the superpowers. The war had a profound impact on the global oil market. The Arab oil embargo, imposed by OPEC in retaliation for Western support of Israel, sent oil prices skyrocketing, triggering an energy crisis that rippled through the global economy. The embargo, while politically motivated, exposed the West's vulnerability to disruptions in oil supplies and highlighted the strategic importance of the Middle East as the world's primary oil-producing region. The Yom Kippur War, though militarily inconclusive, marked a turning point in the Arab-Israeli conflict and had far-reaching geopolitical consequences. The war shattered the myth of Israeli invincibility, emboldened Arab states, and ushered in a new era of Arab-Israeli diplomacy. The conflict also highlighted the growing influence of oil-producing nations and their willingness to use oil as a political weapon, setting the stage for decades of energy insecurity and geopolitical maneuvering. As the Yom Kippur War raged on, the world watched with bated breath. A different kind of crisis was brewing, one that would strike at the heart of the global economy. In the oil-rich capitals of the Arab world, a plan was being hatched. Within OPEC, a sense of urgency and resolve took hold. The organization found itself thrust onto the center stage of international politics. On October 16, 1973, OPEC announced an immediate oil embargo against the United States and the Netherlands. The embargo marked a turning point, transforming oil into a weapon of political and economic warfare. Section 2. Closing the taps, targeting the West's Achilles heel. The OPEC embargo, announced with a mix of defiance and strategic calculation, targeted the West's most vulnerable point, its dependence on Arab oil. The United States, despite being a major oil producer in its own right, had become increasingly reliant on imports, particularly from the oil-rich nations of the Middle East, to fuel its growing economy and sustain its energy-intensive lifestyle. The embargo sent a clear message: the days of cheap and abundant oil were over. The Arab world, united in its opposition to Israel and emboldened by its control over a vital global resource, was no longer content to be a passive supplier of oil to the West. They were determined to use their oil wealth to reshape the geopolitical landscape and advance their own interests. The embargo had immediate and far-reaching consequences. Oil production, already tightly controlled by OPEC, was further curtailed, sending shockwaves through the global oil market. Prices soared, quadrupling in a matter of months, as panic buying and speculation gripped oil traders and consumers alike. Long lines snaked around gas stations, a stark symbol of the sudden scarcity that gripped the West. The embargo exposed the fragility of the global economy, which had become heavily reliant on a steady flow of affordable oil. Industries dependent on oil, from manufacturing to transportation, faced disruptions and soaring costs. Governments scrambled to implement rationing measures, conserve energy, and find alternative sources of supply, but the crisis deepened, casting a long shadow of uncertainty over the future. The price of dependence. The OPEC oil embargo sent shockwaves throughout the world. It disrupted industries, fueled inflation, and exposed global interdependence. Developing countries faced a devastating blow, struggling with soaring energy costs. The crisis widened the gap between rich and poor nations, fueling social unrest. The United States, humbled by its dependence on Arab oil, faced mounting pressure. Europe, reliant on Middle Eastern oil, was also hit hard. The embargo highlighted the interconnectedness and vulnerability of the global economy. Section 4. The petrodollar and the shifting sands of power. The 1973 oil crisis marked a watershed moment, shifting power to oil-producing nations, especially in the Middle East. The petrodollar symbolized this shift, reflecting the wealth and leverage of oil-exporting countries. The oil embargo was profitable for OPEC members. Soaring oil prices created a massive influx of petrodollars. Oil-rich nations were courted by Western governments. Petrodollars transformed these countries, funding infrastructure and military investments. Gulf states became modern, wealthy nations with luxury cars and skyscrapers. The rise of the petrodollar had profound geopolitical implications. Oil-producing nations became major players on the world stage. The OPEC embargo struck at the heart of the West's oil-dependent lifestyle. Almost overnight, the world seemed to shift on its axis. What was once readily available became a scarce and precious resource. The impact was immediate and visceral at local gas stations. Panic buying swept through the land, long lines became a common sight, tempers flared, and a sense of unease crept in. Empty pumps and out-of-gas signs symbolized the crisis. The age of energy insecurity had arrived. The oil crisis of 1973 sent shockwaves through the global economy. Oil prices surged, triggering a severe economic downturn. Industrialized nations reliant on oil were hit hard. Manufacturing and transportation costs soared. Consumers faced higher prices, eroding purchasing power. Inflation spiked, driving up costs across the board. Wages lagged behind, squeezing household budgets. Rising costs and declining confidence led to recession. As the oil crisis deepened, governments around the world grappled with an unprecedented economic and energy crisis. The crisis exposed the limitations of traditional economic policy tools and forced policymakers to confront the realities of a world increasingly interconnected by trade and energy dependence. In the United States, President Nixon faced a confluence of crises that threatened to overwhelm his presidency. The oil embargo, coupled with the economic recession and soaring inflation, eroded public confidence. Nixon responded with measures aimed at mitigating the impact of the crisis. He imposed price controls on gasoline and other essential goods, leading to shortages and long lines. He appealed for energy conservation, urging Americans to lower their thermostats and drive less. He authorized the release of oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, but these reserves were insufficient to offset the loss of Arab oil. Across the Atlantic, European governments faced similar challenges. They implemented rationing measures, imposed price controls, and encouraged energy conservation. The crisis highlighted the continent's dependence on external energy sources and sparked a renewed interest in developing alternative energy sources. The oil crisis forced governments to confront the limits of their power in a globalized world. The crisis demonstrated that even the most powerful nations were vulnerable to disruptions in the global supply of essential resources and highlighted the need for international cooperation to address shared economic and energy challenges. The 1973 oil crisis marked a turning point in global energy policy and everyday life. It ended an era of carefree consumption, especially in the United States. The impact on the automotive industry was profound. Demand for smaller, fuel-efficient vehicles soared. Fuel efficiency became a paramount concern. A new era defined by fuel economy and practicality had begun. The 1973 oil crisis exposed the perils of dependence on a single energy source. The crisis spurred a global scramble for alternatives to oil. Renewable energy sources received renewed attention. Solar, wind, and geothermal energy were seen as potential solutions. Governments invested heavily in research and development. The oil crisis also breathed new life into the nuclear power industry. Nuclear energy was touted as the energy source of the future. However, concerns about reactor safety and waste disposal dampened enthusiasm. The oil crisis forced many countries to reconsider their nuclear ambitions. Energy conservation became a mainstream imperative. Governments implemented policies to reduce energy consumption. Section 3. The Geopolitical Chessboard, Oil, Power, and the Middle East. The 1973 oil crisis had profound and lasting consequences for the geopolitical landscape, particularly in the Middle East. The crisis underscored the strategic importance of oil, transforming the region into a global battleground for influence and control. The oil-rich nations of the Arab world, emboldened by their newfound economic and political clout, played a pivotal role in shaping the post-crisis world order. The crisis highlighted the limits of American power. The United States, accustomed to being the world's undisputed superpower, found itself humbled by its dependence on Arab oil. The embargo, a potent demonstration of Arab solidarity and a direct challenge to American interests, forced the U.S. to reassess its policies in the region. The crisis also had a profound impact on the Arab-Israeli conflict. The oil embargo, imposed in solidarity with Egypt and Syria, demonstrated the potential leverage that Arab oil producers could wield in the conflict. It also highlighted the complex interplay of interests in the region, as the U.S. found itself caught between its support for Israel and its dependence on Arab oil. The oil crisis ushered in an era of petrodiplomacy, as oil-producing nations used their newfound wealth and influence to advance their interests on the global stage. The Gulf states, in particular, emerged as major players in regional and international affairs, using their oil revenues to fund development projects, provide aid to developing countries, and forge alliances with nations around the world. Section 4. The Legacy of Scarcity, a World Transformed. The 1973 oil crisis was more than just an economic event, it was a cultural turning point. It shattered the illusion of limitless abundance. The crisis forced the world to confront the reality of finite resources. It highlighted the interconnectedness of the global economy. The legacy of the oil crisis is visible in today's energy landscape. While the world remains reliant on fossil fuels, the crisis spurred investments in renewable energy and a greater awareness of sustainable energy solutions. The crisis also impacted international relations, underscoring the importance of energy security. The quest for energy security continues to shape foreign policy. The 1973 oil crisis casts a long shadow over the world. It serves as a reminder of the fragility of the global economy and the enduring challenges of managing energy resources. Section 1. Echoes of a Crisis. 50 years on, the echoes of the 1973 oil crisis still reverberate through global politics and the economy. A regional conflict in the Middle East escalated into a global energy crisis, exposing the fragility of a world reliant on a single resource. The crisis shattered the illusion of energy abundance, forcing nations to confront scarcity and interdependencies. Images of long lines, shuttered factories, and anxious faces remind us of the consequences of our energy choices. The crisis shifted global power, emboldening oil-producing nations and ushering in energy insecurity. The 1973 oil crisis was a societal wake-up call. It forced the world to acknowledge the limits of its energy-intensive lifestyle and environmental consequences. The crisis spurred innovation, leading to greater energy efficiency. It sparked interest in renewable energy, planting seeds for a sustainable future. The crisis highlighted the role of government policy in managing energy resources. It led to strategic petroleum reserves, fuel efficiency standards, and energy conservation. The crisis underscored the need for long-term planning, diversification, and international cooperation for a stable energy future. Section 2. Navigating the Energy Labyrinth. Today, the world stands at a crossroads, facing a complex and interconnected set of energy challenges. Climate change, driven by the burning of fossil fuels, poses an existential threat to the planet, demanding a rapid transition to a low-carbon energy future. At the same time, global energy demand continues to rise, driven by population growth and economic development, particularly in emerging economies. The legacy of the 1973 oil crisis offers valuable lessons for navigating this complex energy labyrinth. It underscores the importance of energy diversification, reducing reliance on any single energy source, and fostering a mix of renewable and cleaner energy technologies. It highlights the need for robust energy infrastructure, including smart grids, energy storage systems, and resilient energy transportation networks. The transition to a sustainable energy future requires a fundamental shift in mindset, away from the short-term thinking that characterized the decades leading up to the 1973 oil crisis. It demands a commitment to long-term planning, investment in research and development, and international cooperation to address the global challenges of climate change and energy security. The 1973 oil crisis, while a painful and disruptive event, ultimately served as a catalyst for change. It forced the world to confront its unsustainable energy trajectory and embark on a path towards a more sustainable energy future. The journey ahead will be challenging, requiring innovation, collaboration, and a shared commitment to securing a cleaner, more equitable, and energy-secure world for future generations.